Earlier on, we discussed how the Omnipotent One kicked off four-dimensional space-time with a Big Bang, and then set his crown creation into the pilot seat. A being that was both a product of space-time and also transcends it, not controlled by determinism, patterned, in fact, after the Omnipotent One himself. And that creature, us, made a mess with a capital M. We talked through a few issues that some have with how a loving and righteous God can allow such a mess to be. I think we made some pretty good points in our previous conversation, so I won't go over the same territory here. We will go into some further questions about divine morality that come up as we read further in the biblical narrative. And we'll talk about the fix with a capital F. So, 1,000 or so years into human civilization, things were indeed a mess. According to the biblical narrative, the world had become totally lacking in justice. Anything anyone had was up for grabs, including one's life. The victims were simply those who weren't quick enough or strong enough to exploit the other, but would have nevertheless. The last sparks of mercy and justice were quickly dying out. The human experiment had gone badly wrong, and it was time to call it. But wait, there was one spark of life that hadn't died. Noah still feared God and valued life, justice, and mercy. With him, God started all over again. Now, whatever you make of the flood narrative, the science behind it, where did all the water come from? Where did it go? How was it possible to get two of every species into the ship, including penguins and kangaroos? I don't know. Was there a science behind the tidal wave engulfing the Himalayas in the film 2012? That's just a film. There's no question of whether or not that happened or not, regardless of whether it was written as hard or soft science fiction. Whereas the biblical account has parallels from a number of legends, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the oral traditions of a number of indigenous cultures. Whatever happened is what happened. While the more scientific minds debate the more intricate details of that, as they do with the 6-day bit, we can nevertheless delve into what the message is there for us today. The Omnipotent One gave humanity a new lease on life, however, with a firm set of guidelines. Justice was to be enforced. The wrongful shedding of blood, that is murder, was to be penalized by the life of the perpetrator, and there were other laws as well. The rabbis point out 7 laws in all, some of which are inferred by the overall context, applicable to Jews and Gentiles alike. The practice of equity, against blaspheming the name of God, against idolatry, against immorality, against bloodshed without just cause, against robbery, against devouring a limb torn from a live animal. That's from the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 56a. Those were called the Noahide laws. It appears that at least a few of the commandments have become the basis for human justice in every part of the world. Every culture forbids murder and theft and respects the sanctity of the oath and marriage to an extent. So human civilization got a new start and managed to continue on a slightly more organized fashion. Some laws fell by the wayside, most notably that forbidding idolatry, but at least there was a basis for civilization, the shared understanding that murder and theft would not be tolerated, and to an extent the sanctity of marriage. At least murder and theft weren't tolerated within a community. Between communities, that was a different story. But with basic law within the community, it was solid enough to go to war with other communities, steal their resources, take slaves, demand tribute, and in many cases, commit genocide. Recent archaeological digs on some of the earliest settlements in Britain and Europe have revealed, among other things, mass graves of men, women, and children, obviously slaughtered by other tribes who were moving in to take over their farming and grazing land. We know it was quite common in the Middle East, along with human sacrifice and all the rest of the laundry list, including slavery, gross inequality of women, and ritual prostitution, and others. So, was humanity happy? Would you be happy to live in the time of your noble ancestors? Some were happy, I suppose, as long as they were at the top. For the average free male, there was still the struggle to survive. If you were a bit more well off, the owner of a sizable piece of land, and as well as the slaves to till and harvest it, there would still be the fear of being wiped out by the next invasion, which is why the walls were built so high. And if you were a woman or a slave, or a firstborn child at risk of being offered to the fiery god Molech, well, God wasn't happy. Now, from God's point of view, you're omnipotent, the intelligent creature that you designed after your own pattern to be a true friend for mutual enjoyment so that you could be creative together, who would both be a product of the space-time that you designed and to transcend it, has sunk to such a state as we've been describing. You really wanted to dwell among them, to walk with them as you used to walk with Adam and Eve in the garden, and do things together. But you've been forced to wipe them out at least once. And if things don't turn around, you may need to do it again, and that would break your heart. But you have a plan. The Omnipotent One began with another man, in whom was a spark of love, mercy, and the fear of God. That was Abraham. Through a series of encounters, God and Abraham built a deep relationship which amounted to a very strong agreement or an understanding. The final touch was something that both tested that understanding and confirmed it as an unbreakable promise on the part of God. He asked Abraham to offer his own son as a sacrifice. Wait, back up. A human sacrifice, did I say? Like what we mentioned earlier as one of the atrocities of the time? First, God had no intention of allowing him to complete the act. Secondly, the practice was so commonplace at the time that Abraham's only thought wasn't, is this right? But this is a doozy, but if that's what he wants. It was only later, after the covenant was ratified at Mount Sinai, that God made it clear that humans weren't to be slaughtered as sacrifice. So the test took advantage of Abraham's ignorance. It was a final test of strength of the agreement. God stopped the knife before it came swinging downward, and then made some of the most profound promises to be found in the Bible. That agreement was so strong that after 430 years, after Abraham's clan had grown to be a large ethnic minority living in bondage to the most powerful nation of that time, God did some remarkable things just to get them out. Imagine a weak, insignificant, though numerous, slave race suddenly breaking free from a major world power, all but bringing that power all the way down in the process. Some of the most amazing miracles in the Bible happened during the Exodus and the Sinai experience, all so that God could establish the clan born from Abraham as a nation that would host his dwelling among humanity. The first section of the Bible, the Torah, is all about God establishing his dwelling with humanity through Israel. In fact, that's the key to understanding the Torah, or what's commonly called the Mosaic Law. To most people from a Christian background, that's all about laws and commandments. That's included for sure, but the main point was God dwelling among humanity. What about all the kosher laws and all the commandments? Does God really expect humans to be such perfectionists? Actually, they're to accommodate the fact that God is perfect and humans aren't. They're also about God dwelling among the congregation in the midst of their uncleanness. Leviticus 16:16. They were instructed to build a special shelter to accommodate his presence, a portable temple, and only the priests descended from Aaron were allowed to go inside. They did so with the blood of animals that had been offered as sacrifices. Remember, in an earlier chat, we discussed how evil things done by humanity were sending shockwaves through space-time, but how the ritual slaughter of an animal in the appointed way was a way of absorbing the shock. The Aaronic priesthood was especially trained to perform those sacrifices. So the people, in their role as a host of God's dwelling among humanity, had to keep themselves pure through all the kosher laws, making sure that they were in a state of cleanliness through ritual immersion when visiting the temple to worship and communion with God. The priest had to be even more careful. To be sure, some of the commandments were about morality, how to treat their fellow humans, etc. But a lot of them were simply about Israel keeping herself pure so as to be God's dwelling on the earth. God-fearing Gentiles were not required to keep those laws. Also, some of the commandments were only to be observed in the Holy Land while the temple was standing. Among the moral laws were commandments about taking care of the poor, the widows, the orphans, the refugees. One recurring phrase is, "Remember that you were strangers in the land of Egypt." That's to say, you know what it's like to be a repressed minority. Don't suddenly get on your high horse. Now, the divine morality question that comes up about this time is, what about slavery, which the Torah apparently sanctions? What about the role of women? Remember what we said about the state of humanity at that point of history. Humanity was far from being ready to be told, no more slavery, and women are equal to men. God had only just established his dwelling among humanity, and he would lead them in that direction in easy steps. As it was, the Torah was a radical departure from how the other nations regarded slavery. Slaves, though allowed in the Torah, were humanized. They had certain rights and were considered as part of the family. A slave in the household of a priest, along with the rest of the family, was allowed to partake of the sacrificed meat, which was forbidden to non-priests. Even if a slave were suddenly freed, especially the ones that were born into slavery or voluntarily accepted slavery out of desperation, where would they go? How could they cope? Absolutely no one was giving success and motivation seminars or coaching on self-esteem and self-actualization. The most basic building blocks for any future understanding in that field were only just being laid through the Torah. Eventually, the Torah and other parts of the Bible, though accommodating slavery and the submissive role of women, became the driving force that abolished slavery and brought greater equality to women much later in history. Or, more accurately, it was God's dwelling among humanity within the parameters set by the Torah. So, God established Israel as a nation that would host his presence on earth and thus guarantee the future of humanity. A part of that was settling them in the land that he had promised to Abraham, which meant displacing the local population. And of course, that brings us to one more sticky question. How was genocide okay? The short but incomplete answer is, to build a world in which genocide would not be the norm, room had to be made for the nation that would host God's dwelling among humanity, so as to begin the slow change in that direction. The long answer acknowledges that it isn't as simple as that. Let's just back up and make a few observations. First, it's partly because our thinking is influenced by the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, that the first thing that stands out to us today is, that's totally wrong. In a way, that's good, but it can also obscure our understanding of God's overreaching plan from the beginning. Secondly, we have to remember that the other reason it sounds totally wrong to us at present is our civilization has been exposed to a progression of new concepts and understanding over the past few thousand years, which we could say is a result of God's overarching plan. To people in the ancient world, even with the knowledge of good and evil, it wasn't totally wrong. Even today, how can we tell that we've learned that genocide is totally wrong? Look at Western society as late as World War II. Look at Bosnia, Rwanda, Somalia, Yemen, and Myanmar. The other thing to consider is God's expectations of humanity have progressed. It's part of his overarching plan. It began way back when humanity considered things like genocide and human sacrifice as okay, or at least not out of the question. It was even expected. Absolutely no one was trying to bring rogue nations to justice. There was no such thing as politically correct, or a war crimes tribunal, or Amnesty International, or any concept of accountability whatsoever. God started with us as we were then, used our perceptions to best advantage, and mandated certain actions that would move us along towards a new understanding and a new day in which the same actions would be considered out of the question. I realize that this explanation will not hold water for many people, but if you just stay with me, we'll also note how, even though the Bible appears to mandate countries going to war, it actually lends support to pacifism. I'm not saying that all Christians must be pacifists, only that once we understand God's progressive revelation, we should stop condemning Christian pacifists as being unbiblical. We'll get into that later on, but the general principle is God borrowed a universally practiced method as a necessary evil to give humanity a push towards a new order where such methods would become taboo. Redirecting the imperfections of the time, he set up the perfect to become the norm of the future. Only God could do that. Any time humans try to use this end to justify the means, we go way off track. Moreover, the means that God mandated then will never be called on again, because God has succeeded in bringing about a world in which that could never be so. Anyone trying to claim the Bible as a basis for any act of genocide or murder or brutality in our time is reusing old wineskins. It just won't hold water, let alone new wine. Also, God didn't mandate a holy war against just any nation. He had a very specific criteria. Like it or not, the morals of a civilization can reach a saturation point when a local population has gone beyond the possibility of reform. In some cases, society simply falls apart. Sometimes God puts it out of its misery. We observe that was the case in the time of Noah, and then it happened again to Sodom and Gomorrah. The final test for Sodom was the entire male population showing up to gang rape 2 visitors from out of town who were staying with Lot. Yet another passage where the Torah stresses the wrongness of mistreating immigrants, spotlighting Lot, despite his other faults, as a shining example of hospitality. As for the Canaanites that Israel was to displace, think a nation of pedophiles. We first meet the Canaanites about 500 years earlier when Abraham lived among them. They weren't the greatest of people then, but God told Abraham that he wasn't to inherit the land just yet, as their time wasn't up. Their measure of sin wasn't complete. That's Genesis 15:16. 500 years later, as the Israelites were on the verge of entering, Moses told the people that the sin of the Canaanites was such that the land itself was vomiting them out. Leviticus 18:28. Indeed, during some of their battles with the Canaanites, the Israelite warriors were assisted by bees, giant hailstones, and the sun standing still. What about innocent children? In the case of the Canaanites, the whole culture, even as it involved children, had reached a saturation point. Both archaeological and contemporary records from that time tell us that incest and child sacrifice were the norm in Canaanite family life. Any child surviving that culture would have required professional counseling, as only we could know how to give in the 21st century, as well as capable foster parents, which even in our time are in short supply. Had the Canaanite children survived, they would have not only lived very unhappy lives, but would have been a potential source of contamination to the Israelite society. Yes, they were the victims, but they stood a better chance in the afterlife, where they would be received by a just and merciful God. After what they had been subjected to, it was more merciful to the Canaanite children that they suffered the same fate as their parents. Then again, with the unstoppable advance of the Israelite hordes, and the Canaanites desperate for their gods to come to their rescue, how many yet unsacrificed children do you think there were left once the walls were breached? In ancient times, People's lives were bound up with the collective life of their family or clan. Individualism didn't begin to surface as an alternative until the Torah and other religious and philosophical writings began to stress individual responsibility. Even in our modern society, individualism is a learned trait. Many of us still like the hang of the crowd. In ancient times, the collective mentality was the rule, even to the extent that one's future was determined not by personal choice, but by the family and community. You could say there was one brain in each family or clan. He decided what to do, and they did it. No questions asked, even whether it was right or wrong. If perchance it was wrong, the whole family or clan was punished. If the head of the family was killed in a dispute, the younger members took revenge. Again, no questions asked. And they exacted that revenge on whole families and clans. They also assumed that if the tide went against them, the whole family or clan or village stood to be wiped out. So to them, the Israelite invasion was just more of the same. However, God made it clear that the methods used in that conquest were not to be the norm in fighting future wars. Again, the Torah that became the rule of life as a result of this conquest introduced the concept of individual responsibility, stating that children shall not be put to death for the sins of their parents. Just as when asking Abraham to perform a human sacrifice, God borrowed a universally practiced war method to a necessary evil to be mandated only in that instance, to set up a new order that would usher in an age where such methods would be condemned by world society. Using the imperfections of the time, he set up the perfect to become the norm of the future. About 400 or so years later, we see a similar pattern with King David. David had fought and conquered the territory that was to be part of the Israelite Empire, launching the golden age of Israel's history. However, on expressing his desire to build a temple for God, he was told he was not the one to build the temple, as he was a man of blood. That job would fall to his son, a man of peace. Though God mandated the wars fought by King David, it was all in preparation for an age of no war, a golden age of peace, characterized by vast wealth and wisdom. Again, our own attempts at wars to end all wars invariably end with the negative consequences, so don't try this at home. In fact, I should stress that the only nation that God ever sent off to war, in the sense of being specially chosen for the task, were the Israelites, who were the chosen people for the purpose of enabling God to establish a dwelling among humanity. In fact, they were chosen so that all the nations could one day be chosen. Acts of war performed by the people of Israel were commanded by God only for that time. There was no mandate there for any future wars, whether it be to settle white Christian populations in place of non-Christian indigenous peoples, as has happened in history, or Protestant populations in place of Catholic, as has also happened. Certainly not genocide, which has also happened in the name of Christianity. But it's interesting that David, in doing exactly the job God had given him to do, had disqualified himself from being the man of peace that God was aiming towards. That's where I said the Bible lends support to pacifism, and that is by no means a negative reflection on David. So Solomon built a temple, a far grander version of the one Moses had set up, where God could dwell among humanity in a way visible to the whole world. The Bible records state that during this time of unprecedented peace, world leaders came to visit Solomon to hear his wisdom and admire the magnificence of the temple and the city as a whole. God's dwelling among humanity had become more apparent to the nations, experienced through the peace that prevailed, the wisdom being dispensed by King Solomon, and the prayers being offered at the temple, not to mention the visual experience. That was a major landmark in our landscape, as well as a good stopping point. So let's review what we've covered. Humanity was designed and created to be mates with the Omnipotent One. He put us in charge of the earth, but we made a mess. Because he already put us in the pilot seat, the Omnipotent One honored that position, but initiated a plan to completely restore things to how they're supposed to be. That involved establishing his dwelling among humanity. It started with a portable tarpaulin temple that Moses built in the wilderness, and advanced to the magnificent temple that King Solomon built. Each stage represented an advancement of God's plan to restore humanity to what he created us for. In our next session, we will take it to the ultimate stage. Meanwhile, feel free to visit me on my website, robbycharters.co.uk. That's my name spelled with a Y. My mother had me spell it that way. Charters. You'll find some more of my stuff. I have a few novels, including a graphic novel that I've just finished, and soon, hopefully, a few more of these videos. Anyway, until next time.